Hello, Karibu, and welcome to the Africa Deep Diving YouTube channel and our discussion program, Africa Rising. This week we continue with our series on the psychology of racism in Black people, and we are in the Caribbean and in the Americas. Joining me on the village bench this week, as usual, is our resident villager Edge. Karibu sana.
Thank you, Pedro. Glad to be here.
Glad you're here.
Well, as always.
As always.
Yeah.
You look forward to the topic?
Yes, I'm loving this topic. There's a lot of things I've picked up that I love.
Yes, this tends to be one of the most popular regions in terms of the slave trade, because we're dealing with the Americas and specifically North America. So what we're going to do this week is we're going to divide it roughly. We'll talk about the slave trade as it pertains to South America, and then we'll move on to the Caribbean, and then we'll deal with North America. But before we dive deep into the topic, we will talk about this week's news items.
Yeah. And
we will start with the Nigerian SARS protests. SARS standing for the Special Anti-Robbery Squad.
Yeah.
Edge, what can you tell us about this?
So
very significant.
It's significant. I think it's very interesting because it's all in line with this whole BLM movement and defunding the police. These are conversations that are being had in America. But now you've got, I think, a video that went viral with this special squad actually brutally killing somebody. And as a result of that, you've got all these riots in Nigeria with the youth actually saying they want this squad basically broken off and completely dismantled. And of course the Nigerian government, because of all this, the riots, what has happened is that it said, yes, we're going to look into it, we're going to investigate, but we're also going to dismantle it and redo it and remake it in a different format and redeploy some of these guys into other police departments. And I think this is really where the bone of contention is, which is it's a remake. It's still going to be kind of present in a different name, and the people who've been trained to actually enact such brutality are just going to be transferred elsewhere.
I find it very interesting, actually, that okay, this police unit was named the SARS unit, Special Anti-Robbery Squad unit, and they're now trying to rebrand it and call it the SWAT team. And it's like these people have no kind of cultural understanding as to the connotations of what SWAT actually means, especially in the States.
Exactly.
Is it just total ignorance of the prevailing zeitgeist, or what is it?
Yeah, it's insensitive, and I think we were talking about it earlier, where we were saying it's almost as if in the world today people aren't in tune with other human beings. The compassion is definitely not there.
There's a disconnect.
There's a disconnect. It's like there's a plan that the world has to just be on, or whatever, but you know, regardless of what people are actually saying they want. So, and you know, with Nigeria, I think I'm quite interested in the fact that they have gotten onto the streets and protested this violence, because I think it happens in a lot of African countries, but we haven't seen this kind of youth movement coming up in not to this level in a Black African country. So that's for me why this is very interesting. And of course that it's called SARS when we have Corona. Again, there's a kind of link there. There's a
synergy or a synthesis that, you know, because like you say, it's called SARS. We're going through a pandemic that attacks the respiratory system. We also had George Floyd who says I can't breathe, and police brutality. So there's synthesis and there's a synergy with these whole protests, and they seem to have really captured the imagination of many youth around Africa.
Around Africa as well.
Yeah.
But also I think to the point where, and this is obviously something that we kind of need to look at, maybe at a later date, is really the militarization of police. That the police globally have become much more military in their tactics, as opposed to people who can actually just deal with situations with the force that's required. You kind of feel you're almost dealing with a military, not just a police force, anywhere you are in the world. So yeah, let's see how that goes.
Yeah, and just to finish up that point also, I mean, this SARS unit, I believe it was formed in '92 or in the early '90s anyway.
Yes.
And to that point of the militarization of the police throughout the world, they were ununiformed, and they were kind of a nebulous force that was supposed to be somehow in the background, to now being very, you know, when bureaucracy kind of creeps in, that kind of corruption and brutality that seems to pervade these kind of organizations inevitably takes over.
And interesting you should say that, The narrative of creating such a force was actually, if anybody can remember, is that apparently in Nigeria there was a lot of kidnappings of prominent people, rich, wealthy people, foreigners
in the 90s.
In the 90s, and so there was the need for this protective force. But as you said, it wasn't uniformed at that time. But now it is a uniform. It is very well trained. It's almost like a military force, and of course very brutal. I always kind of think that if you own a gun, you're going to find a reason to use it. And I think it's the same thing. If you've created a brutal force, you're going to have to find a reason to use it. Yeah. So let's see. I really wish the Nigerian youth luck.
Definitely. Yeah. SARS gone rogue. So this is another another form of a pandemic, maybe.
Yes.
So the second news item that we wanted to mention was the schools reopening in Cameroon's English-speaking regions.
Yeah.
I mean, schools have been opening up in many regions in Africa anyway.
Yes.
But this is significant because in Cameroon, the English-speaking regions of Cameroon, which are the northwest and the southwest, they had actually been closed for 3 years. So this was not pandemic-related. They had closed down because it was a protest against being told by La République, as the Ambazonians call it. Ambazonia being those separatists, the separatist movement that wants to secede. It was a protest against being forced to learn in French.
Yeah, learning French.
So they wanted to make French the prevailing language in schools. So schools are reopening in Ambazonia. Maybe we should call it Ambazonia.
Amazonia, yeah.
And the third news item that we wanted to talk about was the Ethiopian parliament voting to sever ties with the Tigray region, who had protested because they felt that the Ethiopian government had postponed the elections for too long and used the coronavirus as an excuse.
An excuse, yeah.
And so we will definitely keep the audience up to date with with any developing stories, and maybe we'll also have developing stories to do with the situation in Mali next week, and the elections in Guinea.
And the elections in Guinea,
which will be very interesting. So those are the news items of the week. This week we have a banger, as the young ones like to say. We have a very interesting topic because this week we talk about the psychology of racism in black people, and we are talking about the Caribbean and the Americas.
Yeah.
Now, what makes this topic very, very interesting is that we now dive much deeper into the topic of slavery and the means and the different means of the slave trade and how that came about.
Yeah, I think right now at this point we've actually been focusing on slavery in terms of its source, the African continent. And now today we get a chance to see where those slaves were going and what was happening in that environment that they were being taken to.
Exactly, and whereas in previous editions we were mainly centered around colonization. We can now delve much deeper into the topic of slavery. So when it comes to the Americas, when it comes to the Caribbean, we have to start with the slave trade and how this came about, because one of the primary arguments that you hear about, especially from imperialist apologists, is that, hey, you know, the slave trade was something that was happening on African shores even before any European powers or imperialist powers came onto African shores, because Africans were selling slaves between themselves. There was intra-tribal slave trade, as well as to the European imperialist masters.
Yes.
So we have to consider the different and the varying natures of slavery and the slave trade, because yes, it is not something that we can sweep under the carpet. Slaves were being sold on African shores. But the primary reason that this was happening was, one, it was a punitive measure that was happening within African kingdoms, because this is before a period of time when there was no prisons. There wasn't a prison system. So the indentured nature of slavery was far less pervasive in terms of the insidiousness that it later became, because it was a punitive measure for, say, people who owed debts, for the criminal element in African society. And also, these were prisoners of war as well.
Exactly.
Because of the intertribal nature of conflict in African shores, the slaves that were taken on or were sold on, it was primarily for those three reasons.
Exactly. And I think just to kind of double click into that is, you know, if you look at the way crimes were handled in the African traditions, is that people tended to be ostracized. So you can imagine if you come from a particular village or a particular people, and then you're no longer allowed onto the homesteads or into the villages of your people.
Yeah.
So you then have to go to other villages or other people's villages, and you're not one of them. So what do they do with you? They might give you a place to stay, but you have no land, you have no access to resources, you have no family, you have no roots. And so you really do become a labor, a person of labor for those other groups that you go to. So that's how slaves were built into the African system. And of course, as you've said, if you had debt that you would not be able to pay, then you needed to then work it off. Yeah. And that's where the slavery came. And then with the intertribal movements and the shifts that were happening on the continent, as people were taking over certain areas, then the prisoners of war at that time would then become slaves to help build and shape that community.
Exactly.
Develops, yeah.
So enter now the European or the imperialist element into the slave trade.
And important to say capitalist, because
Capitalist,
it's not
yes.
just imperialist for nothing. It was a capitalist system that really was looking at all the mechanisms or the inputs of development. Labor was an important factor.
And why that is extremely important that you brought up the issue of capitalism is because it is an economic fact that the first mass capital, actually the use of the word capitalism was sprung about because of the slave trade.
Exactly.
The first mass capital of movement of goods was slaves.
Was slaves.
And
Chattels.
that is what capital was. Yeah, chattel.
Yeah.
So capitalism actually is a direct excrescence or an offshoot of the slave trade. Capitalism is born from the slave trade. So enter the imperialist element. And how does this change the nature of what we knew about the slave trade within African shores? Because, as we have said, slave trading between Africans and even to the European powers was they were punitive measures.
Yeah.
The Europeans, when they came along, added the racial element.
Yeah.
And this was primarily to justify the sale of human beings as commodities, as chattel, as you say, as capital.
Yeah.
And this had to be justified by the use of introducing the racial element to justify this nefarious practice, because they said, hey, the reason we are doing this is because we're selling these people to uplift them. They're of a lesser nature than us. Yeah. And this justifies our economic needs to take them to the plantations which we need, which we will talk about what those plantations were growing shortly.
Yeah.
But
and also just to add to that, which is that the initial group of people that were running the slave trade were mostly like the Portuguese, because the Portuguese were very quick and fast in terms of their naval capabilities and had managed to do their trips around the world and take over certain areas.
Circumvent Africa.
Yeah, exactly. So the Portuguese had also taken other people as slaves. So wherever they went and took over, the people there, if they were not strong enough to resist, would be slaves. But the discovery of Africans as hardier slaves as well is an element that I think we kind of need to build in, because slavery is really about that gradient of what are you good for? What is your speciality? Again, we see it today in the office, you know, what is your speciality? You're an accountant, I'm a lawyer. So in that time, it was really the black slave being a hardier slave to transport for longer periods, and also once they get on there, they're hardier in terms of making, the labor, the ability to work hard. Yeah. So this was from years of understanding that different people who had been enslaved, the best ones were actually Africans. Yes. And so the explosion of the African slave trade.
Yes.
Yeah.
And a couple of things to say about those brilliant points that you mentioned. The reason that they really had to proliferate this idea of Africans as lesser human beings was manifold. But within the historical context of the time, we have to keep in mind the fact that we cannot look at those incidences with today's eyes. Yeah. So in those times, we had just come out of a period of about 700 or just over 700 years of the Moors
ruling Southern Europe.
Yeah. And so this idea of trying to justify the slave trade because blacks were racially inferior to Europeans was a hard sell.
Yeah, it was a new concept.
It was a new concept. It was a hard sell because people were like, hang on a second. People like Othello, I know Othello is a fictional character, but he's representative of the kind of people that were blacks
that were
ruling
Europe.
especially Southern Europe. And so the justification of the slave trade on racial lines was something that they actually had to sell and proliferate to the masses.
To the masses, yeah.
Listen, we're doing this because these guys are not us. Which seems kind of weird in today's society, because people would think, well, you know, a lot of people have thought blacks are inferior to us.
Yeah. So, but that's an interesting point you raise. I think from the perspective of that time, it's also important to note that there were European slaves.
Yeah.
Let's start with that.
Exactly.
And not far from that time, Europeans themselves were serfs.
Yes.
Living in lordships or living in
feudal
systems.
Yes.
So slavery and racism were not intertwined in terms of a concept. They were two separate things.
Yeah.
These were people who didn't have land or who were poor, and therefore then needed to the protection of a lord, and therefore had to be slaves to that lord. But it was never the connection of this race is more predisposed or is actually inferior to us, and then therefore can be used as slaves.
So it is something that had to be enmeshed and amalgamated in terms of two
in terms of two different concepts being molded together.
Race and slavery.
Race and slavery to become a concept that is unified in people's psyche. And this, of course, was being done, and as we were evolving now into this rational period of thinkers, people saying, you know, you need empirical evidence. Everything is about science. There's a causality to things. You know, this whole idea of, is it Newtonian science?
Yes.
Was becoming, you know, something that was considered the best way to analyze and understand things.
Cause and effect.
Cause and effect. And so even with the evolution of things like the evolution theory, was now to solidify and give people an empirical evidence that in fact blacks are inferior and therefore are only good for labor.
Yeah, and to calcify those kind of thoughts within the psyche of the
a number of years of programming.
Yeah.
Because even when you have slaves in the middle of Liverpool, you know, going through Africa, Liverpool, Manchester into the European, the Americas, the locals weren't about looking at these slaves like blacks are inferior. They were like, these are slaves, the same way the Slavs would have been slaves a couple of 100 years back. So that concept had to take time in order to be united and become as one.
And to be solidified within the psyche of
the
people
psyche
who needed
of white
to convince
people.
them. Yes. So yeah, it's important to mention that historical context, that people had to be convinced of the inferiority of the black race.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of the actual slave trade, these slaves, why were they needed? They were needed because of a commodity that was very, very important in terms of the world capitalist movement, which was what? Sugar?
Sugar. So initially, remember, it was the spices.
Yes.
You needed the slaves to be productive sites. As we covered, I think, South Africa, we talked about these charter companies that were at the bottom of Africa that were then funding the ships. So you needed production sites along the route towards other colonies. And these slaves were very good at making sure those production sites were running. And
spices were very important, just to cut in there briefly, because there was no refrigeration, so they needed something to preserve that rotting food.
Exactly.
And to give it a taste that would make the food a bit more palatable for the consumers.
And I think when we talk about the Arabs in Africa, we'll also talk about the movement of Islam in Africa, but we'll also talk about black slaves being used in the salt trade across northern Africa as well. So the slaves were used for production sites, and it wasn't necessarily sugar. It's just that in the Americas and in the Caribbean, then sugar became a major commodity off the back of cotton and tobacco.
And just to mention to the audience and the listening viewers and the watching viewers, we have not forgotten our North American, North African brothers, our Arab brothers. We will deal with that in the next episode. So sugar became a very important commodity. Initially, like Edge mentioned, the use of indentured white labor was very prevalent. Like these laborers would also be ex-convicts or convicts who were serving a prison term or who are under punitive conditions.
Like in the UK, what we call the United Kingdom now, a lot of the slaves were also Scots and Irish people who had actually been taken over by
Especially
the English,
the Irish, yes.
especially the Irish, who were very resistant to English rule. And they were then taken over to some of these colonies to become indentured labor or slaves.
Exactly. So initially, actually, the labor that was used to harvest this sugar cane
was white criminals.
was white criminals, and
Yeah.
you know, it was a very labor-intensive venture.
Yeah.
So it was actually the indigenous population in those islands. Like, we'll deal with the Caribbean and South America first, like we said. And what they found out over time was that because the harvesting of sugar and sugar cane, and later on cotton and tobacco, were very labor-intensive.
Yes.
It was not enough to just use indentured white labor as well as the indigenous population, because one, the indigenous population that were used and that were tricked by charlatans like Christopher Columbus died off because of the hardships of the labor, and two, because of disease. Yeah,
disease. They just couldn't cope in these new environments.
Yeah, and just a quick mention, just a quick word on disease. I always feel like the case for the wiping out of indigenous populations by disease is overstated.
It is.
I feel that they use that to cover up the genocidal tendencies of people like Christopher Columbus, who would use the indigenous population as playthings. Like, Columbus himself was very famous for testing out the efficacy and the usefulness of his weapons and his marauding band of thugs by chopping off limbs and seeing how sharp the swords were and stuff like that. So I always feel that this use of, this bringing up of the disease is something that has been overstated. It might be true. Maybe
well,
you can.
It's
maybe
similar to what we're going through today. You know, when Corona came, I think a lot of people said Africa for sure is going to have hundreds of millions of deaths.
Yeah.
And then Africa is there kind of lagging behind in terms of number of deaths.
Yeah.
So again, this narrative is a very consistent historical narrative.
Yes.
And I think we just need to be awake and aware of it in terms of it being used as a cover for a lot of things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the use of the indigenous populations in the Caribbean and in the South Americas and also in North America and indentured laborers was not going to be enough for the labor-intensive products that were being farmed in these areas.
Yes.
So what happens? The slave trade now becomes
a major
source, and it becomes much bigger in terms of its scope.
Yes.
Whereas before, like this is another aspect in terms of the African slave trade. When people say Africans were trading slaves, it was at a much smaller scale. And
it was not done unnecessarily. There were rules and regulations as to how it happened.
Exactly.
With the slave trade, as we now know it as the slave trade, it was an economic bartering of people specifically for the use of production.
Yes.
So it had to be intense because the building, but there was a lot of building that needed to be done, and there was a lot of colonization that was happening at that time.
And a lot of thieving.
The volume of people was definitely more. The amount of money you were making, now you were making money from slaves. As in, before it was a criminal who would come into your community and therefore had to be indentured labor.
Yeah.
But now, it's actually, if you bring me a couple of African youths, I'm going to exchange something for that. You're going to get some technology. It became an economic enterprise.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's the real difference there.
Exactly. So, it became a mass program or a mass movement or a mass economic movement of people from the west coast of Africa into the Americas.
Yeah.
And how this changed the dynamic of peoples in that region of the world was manifold, and we will definitely get into that. But so because of the labor-intensive nature of the plantations, especially primarily the sugar plantations, more and more of these slaves were needed. So what happened was that the Europeans, primarily the Portuguese, as you said first, and the Spanish would come onto the west coast of Africa, and they would have dealings with the African kingdoms and say, hey, listen, which prisoners of war do you have that we can use as slaves? So those African kingdoms would then sell those slaves to the Portuguese and the Spanish, and later on the British and the French, and sell them on at a price.
Yeah.
And they would then be transported onto the plantations.
Yes.
To South America. The trip to South America from the west coast of Africa was only about 30 to 40 days.
That's amazing. I think we talked about in one of the sessions, we talked about the distance It's
We tend to
such a
forget
short
that. It's
distance
such a short distance.
between
In comparison,
Africa and South America.
and South America and
Yeah.
the Caribbean, in comparison to transporting them to North America,
North America,
which is why there were far fewer slaves transported to North America. I think
Yes.
only about 6% of Africans
went
went to North America, which
Yeah.
is an astonishing thing if you think about it,
Yeah.
because the slave trade to North America has been mythologized and, you know, blown up by Hollywood, rightly so. You know, I'm not trying to downplay the
Yeah.
significance of the slave trade,
Yeah.
but many, many more slaves actually went to South America.
and the
90% of
Caribbeans.
Africans went to South America and the
Yeah.
Caribbean.
Yeah.
So it became an economic movement. The imperialist powers, West Africa, going to the kingdoms, getting the POWs. So what happened is, because of the labor-intensive nature of those plantations, sugar first, and then later on cocoa, tobacco, and
Yeah.
those other products,
Yeah.
demand for slaves goes up.
Yeah.
So what happens is, those African kingdoms now have to start looking for more slaves. And the capture of slaves now becomes an economic reason for those African kingdoms
To
capture
fight
more
other
people,
yeah,
to fight other
people.
Africans.
Yes.
It becomes a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
And so what the European imperialist powers would do was basically pay them with rum, with weapons,
And weapons.
as well
Yeah.
as money.
Yeah.
And so
And to be honest, I don't think much has changed in the world.
much has not changed. In
Much
fact,
has not changed.
the way Africa was armed for these kind of internecine conflicts that happened subsequent to the slave trade can really be traced back to the slave trade.
Yeah.
Like many other things
Exactly.
can be traced back to the slave trade. So the demand for slaves goes up. The need for slaves forces these African kingdoms to start looking for more slaves.
Yes.
And it becomes an economic necessity
Yeah.
for these people to start looking for reasons to go to war.
Interestingly, to the detriment of Africa, because you can
Yeah.
think about, you're only going to get the strong young men
Yes.
who are the labor force in your own communities.
Yes.
And now you've left all that brain power and all that physical power go to the Americas, leaving yourself very bare.
Yes.
So in a way, there needs to be a certain amount of ownership, even amongst Africans,
Yes.
around to, especially concerning how our developmental cycle has been.
Yes.
Right now, things are different. I think if we look at the average age of Africa, it's maybe 20, 25, around there. So there are more youth, but there was a time in Africa where a lot of the youth, especially in West Africa, were being taken out.
Yeah, and can you imagine, if you think about the effects on the demographic
Yes.
kind of makeup
Yeah.
of that region. Like they estimate about 12.5 million total
Yes.
Africans were taken,
Exactly.
which means majority of them were men.
Well, men.
What did that do to the social kind of makeup
Exactly,
of that region?
but women versus men ratio.
Yeah.
So what colonialism in a way did in the Southern African region, what we were discussing in the last episode about moving people into mines and having men in mines and women sitting in villages somewhere without their husbands,
Yeah.
is pretty much the same thing that happened in West Africa
Yeah.
with the slave trade.
Yeah. And just a quick correction. I think I said that these imperialist powers would pay them with money. Actually, money was not such a big thing. It was
No, it
mainly
was
rum,
weapons
weapons, and
new
manufactured
technology,
goods.
yeah, manufactured goods.
Because what was happening in Africa at that time, there was a big demand for brass and iron goods,
Yes.
for farming tools, and also for cooking implements.
Yes.
So they were not being paid with money, but with those three things: weapons, rum, and manufactured goods.
Yeah.
And another vicious cycle that was kind of happening in the background was, in order for some African kingdoms to protect themselves from the slave trade, they would now have to buy these weapons from Europeans.
Yes.
And how would they pay for those weapons and those
Through
manufactured goods?
Labor.
Through other slaves.
Yeah.
So that was a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
So we see this happening. Those slaves are now taken to the Caribbean and South America in
Yeah.
much larger numbers than they were being taken to North America
Yeah.
to work on these sugar plantations. What developed over time was the Spanish were using a system called the Asiento Agreements, which was basically they would subcontract the dirty work of transporting these slaves to
Yeah.
more established nations
Yes.
and companies, and
Yes.
chartered companies, to transport their slaves for them to the South Americas and to the Caribbeans.
It's also important to note that even as you're transporting your slaves across the Atlantic, there are other countries raiding your boats and stealing were slaves as well.
Yes.
So there was a lot of pirating and
exactly. Pirateering was a big thing in the,
was a big thing in that
Atlantic
area
seas
as well.
in that area of time.
Yeah.
Later on in the UK, Charles II issued a royal charter to a company called the Royal African Company, which gave them exclusive rights to the slave trade. Guess who the biggest shareholders of that were? The royal family. So they had exclusive rights. They were eventually usurped by the city of Bristol, actually, because what happened with the city of Bristol